I suppose everything began when Lila and I were on our way to my dad's house. The drive was long, giving me way too much time to think. Maybe that's what got me into trouble. Have you ever experienced that feeling when you're stuck in a car for hours and your mind wanders to places you really wish it wouldn't? That was me. And where did my mind land? Squarely on my marriage. Yeah, me and Lila. We tied the knot young, ridiculously young if I'm being honest. I was just 23, and she was 22. We barely knew what we were getting ourselves into. Anyway, we were en route to see my dad, Charles, who was 45 and getting remarried. This was his second marriage. Mom had passed away years ago. Cancer took her after a long battle. Now, Dad was marrying Jessica, who, funnily enough, is 4 years older than him. She's 49. I just don't get it. After everything with Mom, you'd think he'd want to spend the rest of his life in peace, right? But here he was, diving headfirst into another marriage as if he hadn't learned anything from the first. And don't even get me started on Jessica. She has a daughter named Clara, who's 27 and married to some guy named Mark. No one really knows how old he is, and honestly, who cares? He's a mystery and not the intriguing kind. As we drove along, I found myself staring out the window, and a flood of thoughts about my own life began to surface. We had been married for just over a year, and already things felt too off-kilter. We fought over the most trivial things, like when I'd leave a dish in the sink, and she'd explode over something I'd said in passing. Before I knew it, we'd be engaged in this ridiculous shouting match. I won't lie, a part of me believed we rushed into this. But maybe that's what young people do when they think they have everything figured out. At one point, I turned to her in the car and asked, "Do you think we married too quickly?" She shot me that look, the one that says she doesn't want to respond because she knows it might either irritate me or open up a can of worms. Yeah, that look. But instead of avoiding the question, she said, "Ryan, we're fine. Marriage isn't easy, but we're in it together, right?" Sure, I thought, but it didn't feel fine. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Or maybe her recent distance was making me doubt everything. She wasn't the same woman I had fallen for. Eventually, we arrived at my dad's place. It was a nice house, really nice. The kind of home that screamed that there was a lot going on beneath the surface. My dad came out to greet us, all smiles, trying to convince himself that this wedding was the best thing ever. Jessica wasn't far behind, sporting a similar forced smile. But the real kicker? Clara? She barely managed to say 2 words to either me or Lila. She seemed distant and cold, as if she couldn't care less about this new family arrangement. And to be honest, I couldn't blame her. I felt the same way. Who are we kidding? Trying to pretend this was some happy Brady Bunch dinner was painfully awkward. The atmosphere was strained, all small talk and no one acknowledging the elephant in the room. My dad marrying someone we hardly knew while everyone acted like it was all rainbows and butterflies. Clara sat there quietly while Mark, her husband, kept checking his phone as if he had somewhere better to be. Lila, on her part, tried to act as if everything was normal, but I could see through her facade. She was putting on a show, trying to be the supportive wife, but the truth was we were falling apart, and I was too scared to admit it. After dinner that night, we went back to our room. Staying over was probably one of the dumbest ideas we could have had. I couldn't sleep, with my mind replaying the past few months like a broken record. The fights, the silent treatment, the way Lila seemed glued to her phone at random moments. I didn't want to be that guy, but a part of me couldn't help but wonder if there was something happening that I wasn't aware of. I shook it off, paranoia, right? I was probably just projecting my own insecurities about us onto her. But man, I couldn't shake that gut feeling that something was off. At one point, I leaned over and asked her again, "Are we really okay?" She didn't respond immediately, just stared at the ceiling as if searching for the right words. It felt like an eternity before she finally turned away from me and said, "We're fine, Ryan. Just go to sleep." Yeah, right. Fine. The next morning felt just as strange as the night before. I couldn't tell if it was the tension in the air or if I was simply overthinking everything. Either way, I needed to clear my head, so I decided to step outside for some fresh air. That's when I bumped into Clara. She was already out on the porch, sipping her coffee and looking just as detached as I felt. We struck up a conversation, and it didn't take long for us to discuss our parents' whirlwind marriage. It seemed like they barely knew each other before rushing into this commitment, and neither of us was okay with it. "It's too fast," I said, shaking my head. "I mean, I'm glad Dad's happy, but it feels rushed. Like they didn't even think it through." Clara nodded in agreement. "Exactly. My mom never even mentioned dating after my dad died. And then suddenly, boom, she's married again." She paused, gazing into her cup. "It just doesn't feel right." I found myself opening up to her, perhaps because I sensed she was experiencing the same kind of confusion I was. Or maybe I just needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't Lila. I opened up to Clara about the doubts I'd been wrestling with concerning my marriage, sharing how Lila and I had rushed into tying the knot too young, too quickly, and how the dynamics between us had shifted. "I get that," Clara replied quietly. "Mark and I don't know what's happening anymore. He had been acting so strangely lately, pulling away from her. I don't even feel like I know him anymore." There was a tone in her voice that piqued my interest. It wasn't just sadness, it was suspicion. I didn't press her for more details, but she must have sensed that I was on the same wavelength because she began to open up about Mark. She mentioned how he'd been staying late at work, coming home reeking of perfume that wasn't hers, and how he had become secretive with his phone. Classic signs, right? She didn't have to say it outright. It was clear she suspected he was cheating. And as much as I hated to admit it, I started to wonder if I should be paying more attention to Lila's behavior, too. The day dragged on, and I couldn't shake that conversation from my mind. It felt like Clara had tapped into something within me, a little voice that had been whispering doubts about Lila for a while now. But I had been too afraid to acknowledge it. Then it happened. I was outside, wandering around the backyard, trying to clear my head. I wasn't really focused on where I was going, just lost in thought. That's when I saw them, Lila and Mark together. At first, I didn't even process what I was looking at. My brain struggled to catch up, but there they were, standing uncomfortably close. Before I could react, they kissed. Not just a quick peck, but something more intimate, something I had never witnessed between Lila and anyone else. My heart dropped. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut, and I struggled to catch my breath. I wanted to look away, but my feet felt glued to the ground, leaving me standing there like a fool. I have no idea how long I stood there. It felt like an eternity, though it was probably just a few seconds. A whirlwind of emotions crashed over me. Confusion, anger, betrayal. I wanted to storm over and confront them, demand answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was shock, or perhaps I just wasn't ready to face the harsh reality. So, I stayed hidden, watching for a little longer before I quietly slipped away. My mind was racing. How the hell was this happening? What was Lila doing with Mark? I tried to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. The woman I married, the one I thought I understood, was out there kissing another man, someone who happened to be Clara's husband. It felt like my entire world was crumbling, and I was at a complete loss for what to do next. I made my way back to the house, feeling like I was on autopilot. My hands trembled as I struggled to maintain my composure. The last thing I wanted was for anyone to catch on that something was amiss. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. So, I plastered on a fake smile and went inside, trying to act like everything was fine while internally, I was unraveling. I knew I had to talk to someone about this, but who? I couldn't approach my dad. He was too wrapped up in his own drama with Jessica. Lila was out of the question, and there was no way in hell I was talking to Mark. That left Clara. She was the only one who might grasp the situation, perhaps even help me make sense of what I had just witnessed. Later that day, I found Clara sitting alone on the steps of the front porch, gazing off into the distance. I took a seat next to her, my heart racing in my chest. I wasn't sure how to begin, but I couldn't keep this bottled up any longer. "I saw something today," I said quietly, lowering my voice. "Something I wish I hadn't seen." Clara turned to me, her eyes filled with curiosity and concern. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I saw Lila and Mark together. They were kissing. Her face paled for a moment. She didn't respond, just stared at me in disbelief. Finally, she spoke. I knew it. I fucking knew it. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I had a feeling something was off, but I didn't want to believe it. I nodded, feeling the same way. Neither of us wanted this reality, but there it was, glaring us in the face. We sat in silence for a while, both of us trying to process what we had just uncovered. Our worlds were collapsing, and neither of us knew how to move forward. But one thing was crystal clear: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Dinner that evening was supposed to be normal, or at least as normal as it could be after witnessing my wife making out with another man. I knew I had to discuss it with Clara. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. She was the only one who would understand, who could help me through this mess. Yet there was a weight in my chest. Saying it out loud would make everything real, and there would be no turning back after that. Everyone was busy preparing dinner, so I seized the moment. I found Clara in the kitchen, shuffling dishes around, but her mind seemed elsewhere. I stepped in, hesitating for a second, and then, without wasting any time, I blurted it out. I saw them. Clara froze, gripping the edge of the counter. She didn't even turn around at first. I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to slice through. Slowly, she turned to face me, her eyes wide for a moment before a look of bitter understanding washed over her. "What do you mean?" she asked, but I knew she already understood. "Lila and Mark," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I saw them in the backyard together. They were kissing." Saying it out loud felt like admitting defeat, as if voicing the truth somehow made it worse. For a moment, Clara remained silent, standing there as if trying to process the shocking revelation. After what felt like an eternity, a soft, bitter laugh escaped her lips. It wasn't a laugh born from amusement. It was the sound of someone whose suspicions had finally been validated, and it stung like hell. "I knew it," she said, her voice low and edged with pain. "I fucking knew it." I stayed quiet, at a loss for what to say next. What could I even say? We were both ensnared in this twisted mess, and there was no straightforward way out. Clara walked over to the sink, gazing out the window as if searching for answers in the dark void outside. "I had a feeling something was off," she continued. "Mark's been acting strangely for months," she said. "He's always coming home late, glued to his phone, making excuses. I didn't have any proof until now." She paused, her gaze locking onto mine. "Thanks for telling me. I suppose part of me didn't want to know, but it's better than feeling like I'm losing my mind." We stood there, leaning against the kitchen counter, sharing an unspoken bond forged from betrayal. It was a twisted connection, yet it felt like something. For the first time, I realized I wasn't entirely alone in this chaos. We began to talk. Really talk. She opened up about her marriage to Mark, explaining how it had felt off even before they exchanged vows. "I never truly loved him," she admitted. "Not in the way one should love a person they plan to spend their life with. It was as if they had simply stumbled into the relationship because it felt like the right decision at the time. But now, all that lingered was a sense of anger and disappointment. I've been angry for so long," she confessed, frustration etched on her face. "At him, at myself for sticking around. I knew something was wrong, but I kept hoping it would improve. But now, after all of this, I just don't know anymore." I nodded in understanding. "Yeah, I get that feeling. Lila and I have been in the same boat. The fights, the distance. Sometimes I wonder if we rushed into things, if we were even ready for all of this." It was oddly comforting to realize someone else was navigating the same hell. It felt like we were both sinking, but at least we weren't going down alone. Time slipped away from us as we stood there, pouring out our frustrations, regrets, and anger. The kitchen felt like it existed in a different realm, separated from the rest of the house. It was as if we were trapped in our little bubble of despair and betrayal. Then, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a charged energy crackling in the air between us. Clara turned to me, her expression fierce yet searching, and suddenly blurted out, "If they can do it, why can't we?" The words hung heavily in the air. At first, I didn't grasp her meaning, or maybe I did, but my mind refused to accept it. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Ryan, why should they get to hurt us while we just sit back and take it? If Lila and Mark can betray us, why shouldn't we get something out of it too?" I was taken aback, my heart racing in my chest. I was completely unprepared for this. But as wild as it sounded, I could see where she was coming from. The temptation was there, gnawing at my insides. I felt this strong urge, a desperate need to escape the pain and feel something other than betrayal and anger. "We're both hurting," she continued, her voice almost pleading. "This could be our way out, or at least a chance to get back at them. If they can cheat, why can't we?" I should have said no. I should have turned and walked away, but I didn't. Perhaps it was the anger. Maybe it was the shock. Or perhaps, deep down, I wanted to retaliate in the same way she had been hurt. Whatever the reason, I succumbed to that pull. Before I knew it, we were kissing fiercely. This wasn't like the kisses I shared with Lila. No, this one was desperate and raw, fueled by the pain we were both trying to bury. Our hands roamed over each other, and things escalated quickly. We started tearing at each other's clothes, driven by this twisted need for revenge and escape in that moment. It was no longer about love or even attraction. It was about release. As the tension heightened, a realization struck me. Clara and I weren't merely seeking vengeance against our spouses. We were trying to regain some semblance of control over a situation that had torn our lives apart. This was our way of reclaiming agency in a chaotic scenario, even if it was the wrong choice. We stumbled into the guest room, barely managing to close the door behind us. We were lost in the moment, overwhelmed by emotions that threatened to consume us. Just as things were about to escalate further, the door suddenly burst open. Lila stood there, her eyes wide with shock and fury. The door slammed open with such force that I feared it might break off its hinges. And there she was, Lila. The expression on her face was a tumultuous blend of shock, rage, and something else entirely. Betrayal, perhaps. Her gaze darted between me and Clara, as if she couldn't comprehend the scene unfolding before her. "Are you fucking kidding me, Ryan?" she screamed, her voice trembling with anger. She stormed into the room, fists clenched at her sides. "You're cheating on me with her?" I barely had time to react before she was in my face, eyes ablaze. I was so stunned that I couldn't even find the words. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. Here she was accusing me of cheating. When had that even happened? Just hours ago, I had watched her all over Mark in the backyard. "You're calling me a cheater?" I shot back, my own anger bubbling to the surface. "I saw you, Lila. I saw you with Mark. You want to discuss cheating? Let's fucking talk about it." For a brief moment, her face drained of color, and she blinked, clearly taken aback by my words. But then she regained her composure, straightening up and narrowing her eyes at me. "I wasn't cheating, she began, but I interrupted her. I stepped closer, my voice low but intense. "You really think I didn't see the two of you in the backyard? Don't stand there trying to make me out as the villain here." "Lila, I saw it. I fucking saw everything." For a moment, I expected her to deny it, to try to twist my reality and make me feel like I was imagining things. Instead, she crossed her arms, looking more furious than remorseful. "You don't get it," she snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. "You're always so wrapped up in your own world. You don't pay attention to me. I felt so lonely, Ryan, for months. I tried to talk to you, but you were too busy, too distracted. What was I supposed to do? Just sit there and feel unloved while you ignored me?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was attempting to flip this back on me, making it sound like it was my fault that she was involved with someone else. My blood boiled at the audacity. "You've got to be kidding me," I retorted, my voice rising. "You think being lonely justifies kissing another man? Instead of sneaking around with Mark, why didn't you come and talk to me like a fucking adult?" "I did try to talk to you," she fired back, her face flushed with anger. "But you didn't listen. You never listened. You were so consumed with your own issues that you didn't even notice how unhappy I was." "Unhappy?" I yelled. Maybe if you hadn't been sneaking around behind my back, things could have turned out differently. But no, you had to fuck everything up. You had to betray me. The tension between us was palpable, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the universe. I was trembling with rage, and I could see Lila wasn't backing down either. But just as I was about to speak again, Clara, who had been quietly observing our argument, suddenly interjected. "Oh, don't even try to justify yourself," Clara hissed, stepping forward. "Do you think your excuses make what you did okay? Guess what? Mark's been lying to me too. And you think you're the only one feeling lonely. I hadn't expected Clara to come to my defense, but I could see the fury burning in her eyes, an echo of the same anger I felt. She wasn't just furious with Lila. She was furious at the whole situation, at Mark and everything that had led us here. Just as I was about to respond, we heard footsteps behind us. Of course, Mark walked in, his face falling as he realized the mess he had stumbled into. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice shaky as he glanced from Clara to me. Clara turned on him like a hawk. "What's going on? How about the fact that I know you've been screwing around behind my back with her?" She pointed an accusing finger at Lila. Mark's face drained of color. "Clara, he began, but she cut him off, her voice cold and unwavering. "I don't want to hear your bullshit excuses. Ryan told me what he saw. You and Lila sneaking around like we wouldn't find out. You're both fucking pathetic." The room erupted into chaos. Clara and Mark went at each other, their voices clashing as they hurled accusations back and forth. Mark attempted to deny everything, but Clara wasn't having any of it. She knew I knew, and everyone else knew too. The lies had been laid bare, and there was no going back now. "You don't get it, Clara," Mark yelled, his face flushed with anger. "Our marriage hasn't been working for a long time. This isn't all on me." "Oh, save it," Clara shot back, her voice dripping with venom. "You were the one who gave up, Mark. You stopped caring ages ago." As their argument escalated, I turned my attention back to Lila, who was watching the scene unfold with a mixture of anger and something else. Regret, maybe. But I didn't care. I was done. "I'm done, Lila," I said quietly, my voice heavy with emotion. "I can't do this anymore. I don't trust you, and I don't want to be with someone who can lie to my face like you just did." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at me, her expression hardening again. "So what? You're just going to throw away everything we built together? Just like that?" I shook my head. "You threw it away the second you decided to screw around with Mark." Before she could retort, more commotion erupted at the door. My dad, Charles, and Jessica had arrived, clearly having heard the shouting. They walked in, eyes wide with confusion and shock. "What the hell is going on here?" Charles asked, glancing between me and Lila. Then, as Clara and Mark continued their heated exchange, I saw the realization hit my dad like a freight train. He pieced everything together quickly, his expression falling as he took in the chaos surrounding him. Jessica, on the other hand, looked horrified. "Everyone needs to calm down," Charles said, stepping into the middle of the turmoil. "This is getting out of hand." But it was too late for that. The damage had already been done. Lila and I were shattered. Clara and Mark were finished. Even Charles and Jessica appeared shaken by the scene they had walked into, and I could see the cracks in their own relationship forming right before my eyes. The shouting continued, feeling like it lasted an eternity, accusations flying back and forth, voices rising and falling like a tempest. Through it all, one thing stood out with painful clarity. Nothing would ever be the same again. After what felt like an eternity filled with shouting, accusations, and the release of all our pent-up frustrations, we reached that inevitable breaking point where no further words were needed. It was as if the dust settled around us, leaving only wreckage in its wake. Trust shattered, relationships in ruins, people broken. For a while, we remained silent, as if we had all drained the last reserves of energy from our bodies. I stood there, eyes locked on Lila, feeling an emptiness where love had once thrived. Perhaps that realization was the hardest pill to swallow. Not the betrayal, not the lies, but the acknowledgement that what we had was no longer real. It hadn't been for ages, and now there was nothing left worth saving. As I gazed at her, I realized that for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel compelled to argue or justify anything. I simply felt exhausted. "We need to end this, Lila," I said, my tone quiet yet resolute. To my surprise, she didn't push back. She didn't even respond. She just stood there, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if she had anticipated this moment, yet had hoped it wouldn't come to pass. We should have taken our time. We should have lived a little before diving into something we weren't prepared for. When her eyes finally met mine, there was no trace of anger, only a resigned sadness. "I know," she whispered. "I've known for a while. I just didn't want to admit it." I nodded. There was nothing more to add. We had both been deluding ourselves, thinking we could salvage a relationship that was beyond repair. Now, there was no sense in prolonging the inevitable. "I'm going to file for divorce," I stated, the words tasting bitter yet oddly liberating. "It's over, Lila." She merely nodded, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had settled on them. "Okay," she replied softly. "I'll go stay with my sister for a while. I'll pack my things tonight." Watching her walk away felt surreal, knowing it was a final goodbye. A mix of relief and numbness washed over me. Clara, who had been observing us quietly, let out a long, shaky breath when she saw Lila exit the room. I could sense that she was grappling with similar emotions. We had both endured a hellish experience, and now we were left to figure out how to climb out of it. "I can't do this with Mark anymore," she said almost to herself, but the determination in her voice was unmistakable. "I should have left him long ago. This affair is just a symptom. Our marriage was doomed long before this." I looked at her, recognizing the pain etched in her features, but also a sense of acceptance. Like me, she had finally confronted the reality that this situation was about more than just infidelity. It was about everything that led up to it. The lies, the emotional distance, the lack of love. They had constructed their relationship on shaky ground, and it had finally come crashing down. "I get it," I replied softly. "It's not just one thing. It's everything, and when it's gone, it's truly gone." She nodded, biting her lip. "Yeah, I think I've known for a long time that we were never really happy. I stayed because it was easier than facing the truth. But after today, I can't pretend anymore. I don't love him. I don't even know if I ever really did." Hearing her voice, those words resonated deeply with me. It was as if she was echoing my own thoughts. We had both been living in a surreal state of denial, convincing ourselves that things could be mended, that perhaps happiness awaited us if we simply tried hard enough. Yet sometimes, there's nothing left to salvage. Sometimes the wisest choice is to walk away. "I'm going to leave him," Clara declared, her voice now filled with resolve. "I don't know what lies ahead, but I can't remain in this mess any longer." Just then, Charles and Jessica entered the room, their expressions tight with concern. They had overheard the chaos and witnessed the fallout, and now they stood amidst the debris of their children's lives, probably wondering if they had made a mistake in their own choices. "What's going on?" Charles asked, worry etched into his features. I struggled to find the words. How do you articulate the collapse of everything to someone who is witnessing it unfold in real time? But Charles was quick. He put the pieces together rapidly. "It's all falling apart," I muttered, raking a hand through my hair. "Lila and I are done. Clara is leaving Mark. Honestly, I don't even know where to start with all this." Charles's expression fell, and I could see Jessica fighting back tears. I suppose they thought their new marriage would unite everyone, but instead, it had done the opposite. Rather than blending families, it had torn us all apart. Then, like a ripple effect, Charles turned to Jessica. "Are we doing the right thing?" he asked quietly. Maybe this was a mistake. Jessica's lip quivered, but she held it together, shaking her head. "I don't know, Charles. I really don't. I thought we were happy. But now, seeing all this, maybe we rushed into it. Perhaps we weren't thinking clearly." Watching this unfold was painful. My dad and Jessica had seemed so confident about their new life together, yet now they were questioning everything. Observing their children's lives crumble had forced them to reconsider their own relationship with newfound clarity. Doubt was creeping in, spreading like wildfire. "I love you," Charles said softly, taking Jessica's hand in his. "But maybe we need to take a step back. I don't want to end up like them." Jessica nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Maybe you're right. Perhaps we need to figure out what we really want apart from all of this." I could see it clearly. They were breaking too. It wasn't the loud, dramatic fallout that marked the rest of us. No, it was quiet and painful in its own right. But deep down, I knew my dad and Jessica wouldn't last either. By the end of that night, everything had shifted irreversibly. Lila was gone, and Clara had packed her bags, both ready to leave behind their lives with Mark and Georgia. They didn't have to say it aloud. I could see it in their eyes. They were on the brink of separating as well. That whole weekend had turned into a disaster. It felt like a slow-motion train wreck, where everyone's lives crumbled simultaneously. Yet, strangely enough, there was a sense of relief in the midst of it all. No more pretense, no more lies, just the cold, hard truth. Later that night, as I stood alone in the empty guest room, I realized this was it. The end of everything I had known for the past few years. And while that was terrifying, I also felt an unexpected sense of peace. Sometimes, endings are the only way to pave the path for new beginnings. A few months passed since that fateful night, the night everything fell apart. Honestly, it felt like a lifetime ago. It's strange how time operates differently when you're in the process of rebuilding your life. When the dust settled, Lila was gone, along with everything that had come with her. The marriage, the plans, the future we had envisioned. It was all just over. Not long after her departure, I found a place to call my own, a small apartment. Nothing extravagant, but it was mine. Initially, the silence in that apartment felt suffocating. I remember those first few nights, lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, questioning how I had ended up in this situation. The quiet was oppressive, a stark reminder of everything I had lost. I kept replaying memories of Lila in my head. The arguments, the emotional distance, the affair. I would analyze every moment, wondering what I could have done differently. However, as time wore on, something began to shift. I started to feel okay. The loneliness that initially terrified me gradually transformed into a sense of freedom. I was no longer tied down. I wasn't constantly preoccupied with someone else's needs or opinions. It was just me now, and that felt refreshing. For the first time in years, I wasn't tiptoeing around, bracing myself for the next explosion of anger. I was reclaiming control over my own life. A few weeks after the divorce finalized, Lila moved to another city. I didn't ask where, nor did I care. It was over. There was no more us, and I had come to terms with that. In fact, her departure felt like confirmation that we had made the right choice. There was no looking back, no lingering doubts. The distance between us was more than just physical. It was the closure I desperately needed. I began to focus on myself for the first time in ages. I signed up for guitar lessons, something I had always wanted to do, but had never gotten around to. Those quiet evenings spent on my balcony, strumming the strings, felt just right. It was peaceful, therapeutic, almost. I wasn't great at it yet, but it gave me something to look forward to, something that belonged to me. I also took up running. I signed up for a marathon. Initially, I could barely manage a few miles without feeling like I was about to collapse, but it gradually became easier. Each run felt like I was shedding layers of the old me, the guy who had been stuck in a toxic relationship, the one who was terrified of being alone. With every mile, I felt stronger, not just physically, but mentally too. Running became a metaphor for my life. One step at a time, moving forward, leaving the past behind. One day, out of the blue, I received a message from Clara. She had finally left Mark. I wasn't surprised, considering everything that had transpired. There was no way their marriage could survive the aftermath. She suggested we meet for coffee to catch up, and I agreed. It had been a while since that chaotic night, and I was curious about how she was doing. When we met, it felt different. We had both changed, having endured our own versions of hell, but somehow emerged stronger. We talked about everything, the fights, the divorces, the mess our lives had become. But there was no bitterness lingering between us, just acceptance. I don't regret any of it, Clara said, staring into her coffee cup. Yeah, it was awful, but I needed it. I had to see how far off track I had gotten. Leaving Mark was the best decision I ever made. I'm going back to school now. I feel like I'm starting over, and it feels good. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Same here. As terrible as it was, I think it was necessary. I'm better off now. I'm finally focusing on myself for once. We shared a smile at that. There was a time when I thought there might be something more between us, something beyond just two people who had been cheated on by their spouses. But as we sat there, chatting like old friends, I realized whatever bond we had forged wasn't romantic. It was more about shared survival. Two souls who had weathered the same storm and come out on the other side still standing. We kept in touch after that, but it never evolved beyond friendship, and I was perfectly fine with that. I didn't need anything more. For the first time in my life, I was okay being on my own. Unfortunately, Charles and Jessica didn't fare as well. They ended up divorcing not long after my own split. I think witnessing their children's relationships implode forced them to reevaluate their own marriage, leading them to realize they weren't happy either. I still talk to my dad, but the dynamic is different now. We're both nursing our wounds, trying to figure out how to move forward. He's living on his own too, and I believe he's okay with it. Or at least I hope he is. There's a peculiar sense of closure now, as if a chapter has finally come to an end and a new one is beginning. I spend countless evenings on my apartment balcony, watching the sunset with my guitar in hand, letting my thoughts wander. In those moments, I recognize how far I've come. I'm not the same person I was when all of this started. I've evolved. I'm stronger now, more certain of myself. Lila is gone. Clara has moved on, and even my dad is figuring out his next steps. And here I am, embracing solitude. For the first time, I'm not afraid of it. In fact, I kind of relish it. As the sun sinks below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I take a deep breath and smile to myself. I've weathered the storm. I'm still standing. And for the first time in a long while, I feel truly free. Maybe this was for the best. I whisper, the words hanging in the air as the last rays of sunlight fade away. And for the first time, I genuinely believe it.